Welcome to Power Politics, where we prepare you for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, political science professor at the University of Houston.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, a political science professor, also here at the University of Houston. Thanks for talking about politics with us. We're going to take a little break from the kind of day-to-day grind of it all. I know I need a break. I know that you need a break.
Yes.
I'm sure that everybody else needs a break. And let's talk about something that's less depressing, I guess, and that's about voter turnout. Why is Texas
depressing.
so low? It's relatively less depressing. But it's an important question because Texas is almost always on the bottom of the states when it comes to the list of voter turnout. And we don't like that. We think Texas is the best at everything.
Right.
Barbecue, football, breakfast tacos.
Oh, yeah.
We can debate where the best breakfast tacos are.
That's a different thing.
Collectively, we have the best breakfast tacos. So why is voter turnout so low? So we're going to talk a lot about what political scientists say about this. We'll talk about Texas specifically. We'll look at the demographics of the state, which has a big say in terms of why turnout is so low. But the last thing we're going to do is talk about what I think is the most important thing, and that's how to improve things. This is a menu of options, and there's like hundreds of ways we could make things better. Let's just pick a few, right, that really might solve this problem. So let's get started at the top, and that's just to explain why voter turnout is so low in Texas. Now, it's low generally, like if you compare it across, but Texas, compared to other states, is even lower. So what's going on in the Lone Star State?
Oof. Well, I think there's a lot of dynamics, right, that all intersect and create lower turnout.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start from the, I guess, less complicated ones.
Okay.
But, the first one is we have an election every single year, right? So there might be some quote-unquote voter fatigue.
That's good.
Right?
Yeah.
Elections are at the state level not very competitive. Historically, Texas has been a one-party system, right? Democrats reign for 100 years, right? 94 comes, Republicans turn, and here we are, right? So lack of, having competitive races at the state level and real competitive races might be the case. Okay. But I also think that, as you said, demographics play a very important role, right? Especially when you're looking at the inclusion of new voters almost every 2 years, right? You have a big chunk of that. And part of that also is that, Latinos represent a majority of that population growth. When you compare 2020 with 2020, the last census, 95% of the growth was attributed to minorities, and almost more than half was attributed to Latino growth. Yeah. So there are implications there in terms of that, and also how the demographic or the age pyramid is distributed amongst within the Latino electorate, is that simply a lot of them are already or too young to vote. So you have a change in electorate that keeps adding more and more and more numbers to that denominator, right? But it's not growing fast.
The numerator is
not growing fast.
Yeah, I agree. All these things are definitely problematic. And we've seen Texas turnout swing from like 35% of the voting age population to sometimes above 50%, but it's pretty rare. And that's not a good place to be, right? Yeah. You see routinely millions of people who don't vote, who are otherwise eligible to vote. So part of it is just getting people registered to vote. That in and of itself is a barrier, right? Some states don't have a registration process. Like you are automatically registered to vote. We call it automatic voter registration. Right. Sometimes it's done online, which makes it even easier since, we do everything online. I haven't been to like a Target in, 5 years because you can buy stuff on Amazon if you plan ahead. So that's just the world that we live in. But like our voting process is not in that world right now. So that by itself, the registration process, which is cumbersome to some degree
Right.
is another part of it. Generally speaking, the way political scientists think about this is that it's about cost of voting. Now, the cost can be lots of stuff. It can be your time. It can be the information it takes
Right.
for you to have to research to see where to go vote or who you want to vote for. So that cost is high enough in some places that voter turnout's just going to be lower. So I looked at some of the reasons why people say that they don't vote. And the sort of the Congressional Cooperative Election Survey does this every 2 years. And they ask people kind of, if you didn't vote, why didn't you vote? So the biggest reason that people didn't vote in Texas is what? Take a guess. What do you think is the biggest reason?
I don't know, time consuming.
Too time consuming. Yeah. Actually, what they say is that they forgot or they're too busy. So that's 36% of the people who didn't vote say that that's the case. Is that a real thing? Maybe, right? It could be just convenience, but that's a big number. And the reason it's big is that it is hard to vote, right? It does take more time. You really have to want it. The second biggest reason is that people said they didn't have the correct form of ID or didn't think they had the right form of ID. And we know from other work that sometimes people don't think they have the right form of ID, but they actually do. So these are some of the big issues. And I do think that that's something that has to be fixed. And some structural things cannot be fixed, but there are some real limitations. So let me ask you more in detail about the Latino turnout, because this is a huge issue because Texas is becoming rapidly a majority minority state. And that is going to have profound implications for the demographics, the politics, as well as the turnout. So the Hispanic population in Texas is the second in the country, right? So this is big. 4 in 10 Hispanics are eligible to vote, ranking Texas about 17th nationwide. But by contrast, about 3/4 of the state's white population is eligible to vote. So if you just do some simple comparisons there, it's a demographic issue, but it also has sort of translated to these political issues. So as you said earlier, this is a young state that's becoming much more kind of diverse. The question is, how do you change the way that people think about politics or how we approach elections to get people to come out to vote who otherwise wouldn't?
Well, I think, first of all, when you're thinking about the Latino electorate, you cannot think of it as non-Hispanic whites, right? Why? Because within Latinos, I think you have at least 3 different electorates, right? You have those that cannot be registered because they're too young or they simply can't. Those are registered and do not vote for whatever reason. And then those who are registered and actually vote, right? So when you look at that and start, putting the pieces together, you get a very different picture, right? Latino turnout has been increasing slowly, right? But because you have more people and therefore
they're adding more people. So
there are more people. So it's something that is happening, but it's happening at a lower pace that we would like to see. The other very important part is how political socialization is taking place. So political socialization doesn't have to do anything with indoctrination or anything like that. It's just, normal civic education, right? So when you're talking about, for example, second-generation migrants, right? Latinos, Mexican Americans, or Venezuelan Americans, Salvadoran Americans, et cetera, that have grown in the U.S., right? Were born in the U.S., and still are going through that political socialization process, at school with social studies classes, et cetera. There's not necessarily a focus on civic education.
Interesting,
right?
yeah.
I mean, the school curriculum does not focus on civic education. Not partisan, just normal civic education. Why voting is important. Why this is important. How this works, et cetera. It's extremely important. You don't have it, right? You're not creating those habits in terms of your participation is important. The second important point is that when you're looking, for example, at third, fourth, fifth Latino generations, is they behave like a normal average voter, right? Because that political socialization has taken place. So what you need to do is how you incorporate it into the political process, and that has to do with education, GOTV, getting out to vote efforts, right? And again, making voting easy. And the conceptualization that we have in terms of a democratic system is we start with the basis that everybody cheats. And that is not the case in Texas, right? There's no voter fraud.
Right.
Like if you want voter
Very
fraud,
little.
look at other countries. Here, we do not have voter fraud that is going to be significantly, impactful. You have, some instances, but that's it. So the way that I see elections is, and I've said this before, it's a market competition, right? You're choosing between two products, product A and product B.
Yeah.
So in order for you to do that, you just set the example, right? It's you buy on Amazon. You don't go to Target and say, oh, no, I have to drive. I mean, the thing is going to come here.
Parking.
You want easy thingy, and that's how the market economy works. And we haven't transitioned that in terms of elections.
That's a good point.
We make it more complicated and more complicated and more complicated.
Right. And I want to talk about that too. But I do think you're right that there's a kind of the characteristic of a voter, right? So to me, voters who are going to be more frequently likely to turn out have 4 M's. That's money, mortgages, marriages, and mortarboards, right? The flat hat that you wear when you graduate. So if you've got better education, if you've got a mortgage, statistically, those people are more likely to vote. People who are married are more likely to vote, and people who have more money are more likely to vote. And so if you look at this with respect to the 2 biggest groups that don't turn out in big numbers in Texas, it's the Latinos and the younger voters. Sometimes both, right? Like you said. So the educational attainment for Latinos is a lot lower than it is for other age groups. Home ownership is a lot lower than it is among Latinos than for other age groups. Obviously, like I said, they're younger. So that's going to shift that dynamic in a way that makes it hard for them to be able to, make it work, right? Which other people do. And so I think that's one dynamic that can be changed and will change, right? I mean, as the state grows, it has to have a competent workforce. You've talked a lot about this. And so I think that's the kind of thing that is something that can change, but it does take time. And as we've seen, it's really, really a slow process. So civic education is one of those things too. And we should definitely get into that because obviously it's critically important. But the other thing, like we said, is that every state has barriers to voting. And it depends on where you are with respect to how much it affects a person's probability of turning out. A lot of states are moving in a direction where they're basically trying to harden the process so that they have fewer vote fraud cases. And like you mentioned, it's a very kind of rare instance, right? You're more likely to get struck by lightning than to see voter fraud, but it does still happen. And so what's happening is that as a discussion from a political point of view, it's being used as a way to be able to kind of limit kind of what people can do. And maybe it's working, but maybe it's working too well, right? Where other people then are not turning out to vote. So perhaps there are ways to calibrate this that make it better. So for instance, if you look at Senate Bill 1 in 2021, and you can sort of track this all the way back to 2017 and the 2019 sessions also, we've seen a significant overhaul of voting laws in Texas. So new voter ID requirements for mail voting, right, which we've seen decline in the last few election cycles. We've also seen that mail ballots cannot be sent unsolicited, so that like a party can't just sort of send everybody who's eligible to vote by mail a ballot. County officials can't do that either, although parties do tend to do it. So maybe there's a bit of a wiggle room there. The bills have also banned 24-hour voting. They've banned drive-through voting, and they've allowed for the Secretary of State's office to have kind of monthly voter checks to see kind of if they can purge people who aren't eligible to vote. So that's a lot in a very short period that adds to a lot of other kind of restrictions. They're just built into the system. Is it possible that these things are going to be changed in the next few cycles where people see how bad voter turnout is and then make a decision that maybe we should alter that?
I don't think so, right? Because I mean, these laws certainly benefit certain constituents than others, right? You're making, the probability of playing or the probability of entering these, free market more complicated, right? It's becoming more and more burdensome. So if it becomes more complicated, it's like, no. And that is tied to something that we might talk about it later is, the cost. That cost is, we vote on Tuesdays.
Yeah, that's good. Why don't we have or let's have it a holiday, right? That's something people have looked at.
And that's what happens, in other countries, either voting is, for example, in Argentina, is mandatory, right? You need to show that you participated, right?
Or they fine you, right?
Yeah. And, in Mexico, it takes on a Sunday, right?
Yeah.
Where you have those days that, the probability that someone is working is lower. So here is middle of the day, Tuesday. You have hourly workers that, yes, you're entitled to do that, but you're not going to get paid.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
So it's like,
they can't afford
do you
to take
want
off.
to go and vote or get paid, for 2 or 3 hours at those, $45 or $50 that I'm going to forego? I mean, that's tank full of gas.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and that's a cost of voting, right? Like literally a cost.
That's a cost.
Yeah.
And voters are sophisticated enough to say, hell no.
Yeah, I can't do that. No, it's a great point. And I want to talk about kind of solutions, right? So we've talked a lot about the problems and barriers, and we know Texas falls pretty high on the list of states with barriers. Right? People have done studies that look at how hard it is to vote across the country, and Texas is always in the top 5. So this is definitely something that's a problem. But what's true also is that there are a lot of just clever ways that political scientists have discovered that you can do to juice up turnout, right? A lot of them really small, almost costless. And if we had some political will to do it, then I think you could really make a sizable difference because of just the sheer magnitude of voters. So I think we need a new deal for voting in this country. We really have to invest ourselves in getting people to turn out to vote. So that means just a panoply of different things to do. So having election day off is a great one. Getting more money to local officials who administer elections is another. We've seen over the last few years the hollowing out of the elected officials at the local level. They're leaving their jobs for all kinds of reasons. We know from one of our colleagues that has done surveys of these local election administrators, and they're scared, they're unhappy, they're stressed, they're worried, and they quit. And as a result, then you don't have a kind of, firm basis and that kind of, that kind of longevity you need in those jobs to be able to make that happen. So money to them, right? Like what happened after the 2000 election, right? You saw a lot of money poured into election administration because they're like, we don't want to have this be the reason that our elections are seen to be inadequate, right? Or that there's really some kind of a problem that then jeopardizes the outcome. So more money in that's critical, right? So spending a lot of money on that. I think these things are good. I also put down here, I want to ask you about this. Treat election information like a silver alert. You're driving down the highway and it has the big sign. It's like silver alert, we're looking for this car in this particular place. Let's get people, informed about voting, right? So like we said earlier, a lot of people don't vote because they don't know that they're supposed to vote. And so how about that, right? Just more efforts and a real fundamental push to get people to understand how important it is and then get them to turn out to vote. So go.
Well, I mean, yes, absolutely. But one of the things is that, election administration and running elections and this and that has become over partisan. Right?
Yeah.
And that polarization is hurting, the funding is hurting, how, election administrators are questioned about their integrity, so on and so forth, right? So you have, just kicking the horse, right, in such a way that it's like, wait, I mean, the horse is pulling the cart. We cannot kill the horse. Because once you enter in that rabbit hole, it's extremely complicated to get out. And, we have seen it in many other Western democracies where things have gone south pretty bad. So the other important point is, again, voting and elections, in my mind, should be a national holiday.
Interesting, yeah.
100% national holiday, and it would be, the party of democracy.
I like it.
Right?
Yeah. And we have like keggers and barbecues.
Sure, why not?
And then we go vote. I love it. I think that's great. In the country, we do a kind of patchwork effect, right? Literally by county is how we administer elections.
Right.
That's such a micro level. And even if you look at how we physically vote, the machines we vote on, that changes a lot by county and by state. So there's so much variation that maybe it does recall for this national strategy. I think this is something we can work with. Let me ask you about this. So a lot of political science work that's experimentally done tries to see how we can juice people to get to come vote. And one of the things people find is that if you do two things, if you shame them or if you thank them for voting, I'm okay either way as long as they come out to vote, right? But basically, like experimentally, you send people a reminder that says, hey, thanks for voting last time, please do it again. Or we say, hey, guess what? All your neighbors have voted. You should vote too. So it would take, a few $1 million given to the Texas Secretary of State, and they could administer this program, which would then juice up turnout, I think, by a lot. So that's an option, I think, that's really kind of a low cost, nonpartisan way to do this. Reminding people that their ballots are safe, that's another thing that increases turnout, and that's something useful. Talking to people in their language is also critical, right? So we're talking about Latino turnout earlier. Political science scholars have found that Spanish language messages in a variety of mediums have been successful at increasing turnout among people. And so that's useful, I think, also. We've done our own work on this and texting and found that there's some success. So that's something that is possible. These are all small changes that can make a huge difference if you kind of magnify at times the entirety of the state.
Yeah, but once again, you are entering into this question about, do we really like competitive markets, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, if you ask, Amazon, do you really like competitive markets? And it's like, oh, yeah, we like competitive markets. But at the very end, it's like, oh, hell no, we don't want
you here.
Yeah, we don't want you here. We don't want competition, right?
Yeah.
And in politics, it's the same thing. Yeah. And Republicans and Democrats are exactly the same, right? In terms of, fending off the competition, but not really having that discussion. Because at the end, it's about the policy outcomes, right? And how you're buying that particular, voting that particular product that is going to have an impact on your needs, your wants, your preferences, right? So it's a matter of, yes, having them being educated. But, let me ask you this question, right? When you're going to purchase a vehicle, right? You do a lot of research.
Yeah.
You're motivated to do it because you see a benefit. And that benefit is, you like your truck or,
you get a better outcome for
whatever,
for your
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So at the end, you're going to make a choice and say, well, I want this car or whatever, right? Why we don't have that in voting, right? People, it's lack of information, it's anything like that, but it's, you do the research for the car.
Yeah.
Why are you not doing the research for the car? Is it civic education?
Right.
Is it lack of interest?
That's a great point.
Is it that perhaps, and this is just a crazy idea, that, both the political system is not responsive to the voters' needs, wants, and preferences.
Yeah.
And at the end, you say, like, why bother? I mean, they're not going to pay attention to me.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, political efficacy is very low in Texas because they believe that sort of their vote doesn't matter. And that's contributing to the kind of low turnout.
Right.
And that makes sense because some of the elections aren't that competitive, especially at the state level, so you don't see people turn out. But I do think civic education can have a big impact here. In fact, scholarship shows that if you teach people empathy and empowerment, then that does have an effect of getting them more engaged in the process. And if they understand that process better, then they're going to be more likely to turn out to vote. So we can revamp how we teach civics in this country. I think that's something that there's enough of a roadmap here to allow that to happen. But it does require that kind of effort, right? People really have to want to make that change. And that's hard, right? Because you're talking about a lot of kind of faith that that's going to work when you redo all these things.
And do you think that given our current political uber partisan climate is going to work?
It's really hard. Yeah, and this requires sort of so much coaching that people have to see through this partisan divide. I have faith that the next generation will see through some of these issues and it won't be as big of a problem, but it is going to take time and it is going to take that education. So it will happen.
But we have those models, right? Look at the League of Women Voters. I mean, they put out a great guide. It's zero partisan, right? Like non-partisan whatsoever. They just give you the information. It's like, here you go.
Candidate A, candidate B, like here's what they say, you take a choice.
You choose.
Those are great guides. And actually a lot of media organizations do similar stuff. And so it's useful. But one problem is that you can't always take it into the polling place with you. You can't take your phone out in the polling place. So that's a law maybe that needs to be tweaked, right? Like let people just access information. Like I understand that we have to prevent them from cheating in various ways, but like they still need to access the information. So I literally have to handwrite the stuff because we teach.
I do the same.
We have all these judges we have to vote for, right? And I can't remember all the names of every person and what, exact, court it was and what number it was. There's so many. So
the length of the ballots is another problem, right?
Yeah, that's great. No, and the loss of straight ticket voting, right, which the state took away a couple of years ago, now means that basically you've got fewer people who are kind of motivated by partisanship can go and sort of just say, let's vote for this straight ticket in one party and then leave it be, right? Now you have to vote all the way down the ballot or not. And frankly, most people don't vote all the way down the ballot because there's just so much going on.
Yep.
So I think that's an issue. But I want to ask you about one last thing before we go. This is something that I get asked a lot, and that's ranked choice voting. This is a kind of, it's an experiment that some municipalities have been working on. It's basically like an instant runoff voting.
Right.
So it works in the following way. Basically, voters have to rank their candidates on the ballot in order of preference, right?
Okay.
So A, B, C, you vote 1, 2, 3, or 3, 2, 1, whatever your preferences are, right? And then what happens is mathematically they're able to kind of stimulate sort of who gets the most first place votes, second place votes. And so sometimes it might be the case that some people really like the first person a lot. They vote for that person. And sometimes, the second person gets more votes because they're getting more second choice votes, right? Because partisanship means you're going to vote for this party first and this party last. Other people are voting for this party first, this party last. So sometimes the second choice is the first choice.
Right.
What do you think about this as a solution to some of the partisanship that is structurally built into our kind of winner-take-all system?
Well, I think it's very interesting, right? And I think that, there, especially given that we have effectively a two-party system, I think it's very interesting because it allows you to vote strategically in terms of different preferences and in terms of different candidates that might be from same party or whatnot, but allows you to have to order your own preferences in a way that you could see that the political system is working for you. So I'm all about for that particular aspect. And we see it in all the aspects of our lives, right? You go to a restaurant and then you rank choice your thing. It's like, I want chicken. Oh, we don't have chicken, but we want fish or whatever it is, right?
Choice,
and suddenly you end up eating pasta, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But that's fine, and you're happy with it.
Yeah.
But I think it's something that would allow us to increase turnout. And in that note, I think that if you are able to go and register and go vote. But for this week, just vote. I'm Jeronimo Cortina.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus. The conversation keeps up next week.